All right, today's lesson concerns one of my favorite philosophers, Leibniz. I wrote my doctoral thesis on him, and I'm a great fan of his work and the qualities of his reasoning. He is extremely insightful. On this short introductory video, I want to discuss triage and the adequacy of Leibniz's solution to the problem of evil, indicating ultimately that perhaps it doesn't work as well as Leibniz thought, despite the relative brilliance of his solution. Now, the triage scenario, we're going to discuss the idea that God, despite being all powerful, has a particular will that does not come to pass. And that may seem directly contradictory. So let me give you an image that I think was guiding Leibniz a bit in his discussion, and this will also be discussed in the notes. Now, in a triage situation, in a hospital, typically today you simply have somebody in the emergency room placing injured people according to their injuries where they should go. But in a military context, triage can be much more robust. Basically, when your medical resources are stretched to their limit, a doctor will have to decide where to apply those medical resources. So after a major battle, there are simply too many soldiers to treat. Some of them will just have to stay in pain, but they'll be all right, and they'll simply be put aside. Others could potentially be treated, but they would require an excessive amount of medical resources, and so the doctors simply will have to leave them aside. Now, in a triage scenario after a major battle, the doctors have as their goal to save the largest number of people possible. If they cannot save everyone. They have to make a decision who receives those medical resources and who does not. All right, so it's a very difficult and very painful decision for the doctors to make, especially in our contemporary world and with their ethical commitments. All right, so let's imagine a scenario, a major battle. A bunch of soldiers are coming in very badly busted up. The medical resources are stretched to their limit, and there's a young man, looks apparently full of promise, but he's very badly hurt, and he would require an immediate operation. Let's say that it would take about 10 hours, and his survival chances are roughly 50-50. Now, in the larger context, the doctor may decide that he simply does not have the medical resources to use on this soldier. He may simply allow him to die. Because in an attempt to save him, to do the operation, he may lose 3 or 4 other soldiers who would have a much greater chance of survival than the one soldier who would require a massive outlay of medical resources. So the doctor may simply say, look, I have to save the greatest number. Attempting to save this soldier would violate that, and so he's going to leave it aside, given his general desire to save the greatest number possible. Now, consider the situation in isolation. Forget about the triage scenario. Forget about the fact that the medical resources are stretched to their limit, and simply consider what the doctor would wish in isolation with regard to that young soldier. And of course, he would wish to save him. It's a 50-50 chance. It's not bad. 10 hours of his profession, after all, is a very reasonable outlay to save somebody's life. So if you consider the situation between simply the doctor and the soldier in isolation, without the larger context, then of course the doctor has a particular will to save the soldier. But given his general will to save the greatest number possible, he's not going to act on that particular will in the scenario I described. So notice how this general will can be in disagreement with the particular will, and how sometimes the particular will not be acted upon. Leibniz's solution to the problem of evil is basically following a model that is very similar to this sort of triage scenario. Now, at the end of Leibniz's solution, we have to ask ourselves: is it really adequate? Can we really accept what he's saying? This was generally accepted when he first published it in the Theodicy, more than here in the Discourse on Metaphysics, which was left unpublished in the first decade of the 18th century. However, after the Lisbon earthquake, there was a definite movement away from this, and especially after the popularity of Voltaire's short story Candide, for those who are familiar with it. Now, the Lisbon earthquake just seems to be extreme. So for Leibniz is basically saying that this is the best of all possible worlds, that any evil is more than compensated for by goodness elsewhere, not necessarily even in our world, but somewhere in the universe and somewhere in the grand scheme of things. And of course, that is surely possible, no matter how great the evil that occurs. But sometimes it's going to be really hard to accept when staring in the face of some really, really extreme evil. If you read Candide, by the way, the character Pangloss is based on Leibniz. Now, what takes place with the Lisbon earthquake, for those unfamiliar with it? In 1755, a major earthquake strikes Lisbon on All Saints' Day. Now, Lisbon at the time is one of the few capital cities in Europe that have remained very religious. Free thinkers have become much more common in London, in Paris, in Berlin, even in Rome. But in Lisbon, this is not the case. It stayed very Catholic, it stayed very traditional. So it's not striking, the earthquake is not falling upon the sinners, as it were. It's falling upon perhaps the most pious people of Europe. Now, All Saints' Day, November 1st, is a major Catholic holiday, and that is when the earthquake strikes in the morning. All Catholics in Catholic countries, especially ones that are still quite pious, would be in church on the morning of All Saints' Day. So all the inhabitants of Lisbon were in church, almost all were in church on that particular morning. When the earthquake struck. Now, this had a terrible effect. It was a very powerful earthquake, well over 8 on the Richter scale, of a strength that would still flatten American cities, for the record. And the naves of the roofs simply collapsed upon the people within the churches, crushing them to death. Women, children, of course, being suffering massive casualties as these great roofs simply collapsed upon them. Now, the few people who weren't in church were actually preparing for the feast after the church, and this is a lovely tradition in the Iberian Peninsula where they will basically cook a whole calf together over an open spit. So you had all of these open fires throughout the city preparing for the feast after the church services, again, part of this holiday that would take place. Now, all these open fires, this is very unusual to have these, they got out of control and they quickly set the city aflame. So you had fires burning up the city all over the place pretty much at the same time. Again, because of the holiday nature of the festival. So those who were not crushed immediately by the collapsing roofs of the churches had to get out of the flames. Well, not to worry. Well, yes, to worry. Many of them perished in the flames as well. But they are on the river Tagus. Now, Lisbon today actually goes all the way to the coast, but at the time it was a few miles from the coast still. It hadn't grown to the extent that it has today. But it's on the river Tagus, the major river in Spain. So what the inhabitants did is they fled from their burning city into the river to escape the flames. Reasonable sort of choice, get to water. But when they get to the Tagus River, they find something amazing. There's no water in the Tagus. The water's gone, just disappeared. And they had just enough time to collect a large number of the survivors up until that point into the riverbed, wondering what happened to the river when, you may have guessed it, the tsunami hits. Essentially, just as it happened a few years ago in Asia. Essentially, the earthquake had created a tsunami wave. It had swept, first of all, the water out to a great distance, and then it comes crashing back. And a lot of the survivors up until that point are wiped out in a flood. It seems incredibly cruel the way this took place. Any other day of the year, or later in the day, the number of people who would perish would be much less. This triple combination of earthquakes with the naves collapsing upon people, the fires throughout the city, and then the tsunami wiping out the survivors, made this one of the real tragedies of the 18th century. Now, after Voltaire tells of this historical event, and he tells of this event in his short story Candide, you then have the character Pangloss, representing Leibniz, say, yes, yes, but this is part of the best of all possible worlds. It rings hollow. So don't underestimate the problem of evil. Not just human-caused evil, but natural evil. There is some extreme natural evil in the world, some of which has nothing to do with human beings, nothing to do with human free will, that is really hard to account for on any model that holds that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent. All right. Enjoy coming to understand Leibniz's solution in evil on paragraphs 1 to 7 of the Discourse on Metaphysics.